You're listening to the College is Worth It podcast. Learn from leaders who are transforming higher education to ensure that a college degree will pay off for this generation and the next by exploring innovations in education with us in each episode. And now your host, V. Nguyen.
Hey everyone, this is V and you're listening to the College is Worth It podcast. I'm really excited to be speaking with Peter Samuelson today, who is the CEO and founder of our sponsor, Ardeo Education Solutions. It is with extreme pleasure that I introduce Peter Samuelson. Hi Peter, how are you doing today?
Hi there, V. Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course, it's my pleasure. I'm really excited to speak with you and about how you're able to find a successful startup, which is, of course, Ardeo Education Solutions, a company that partners with higher education institutions to give out LRAPs. But before we get into Ardeo specifically, where does the story start for you, more specifically, your higher education story?
So it goes back to college. As I was a high school senior looking at colleges, I really wanted to go to Wheaton College up in Chicago. Mm-hmm. And I'm just a classic story of I couldn't afford it. My mom taught at a small college in Kansas, and I got free tuition at Greenville College in Illinois. And so Wheaton College offered very little financial aid, and it was really hard to decide to borrow a lot of money when I could go for just the cost of room and board to Greenville. So, a very traditional story. You hear this a lot talking to families about where their sons or daughters going to college or where did they go to college. And you hear so often the I can't afford it story. So I went somewhere else, right? Had a great time at Greenville, but it wasn't my first choice, wasn't the preferred college. And that just happens a lot. So that's where it starts in just my own personal experience. And at that point, there was no idea for LRAP, for the Loan Repayment Assistance Programs. There was no idea to help students in that situation, but I lived through that frustration of not being able to go to my preferred school. When I got done with Greenville in my senior year, I was looking at law schools and really chose law schools out of a process of elimination. I didn't want to go to med school. I don't like blood. Thought about doing a PhD, but couldn't figure out a topic or a field I wanted to study that much. And everyone said law schools kept your options open. So I was looking at law schools, and ultimately the choice came down between Chicago and Yale. Yale was the best law school in the country, according to most of the rankings and kind of just the conventional wisdom. Chicago was close by in the Midwest, and they offered me a lot more money, $20,000 more than Yale. And so I thought I was going to go to Chicago. And then I discovered Yale had a loan repayment assistance program. And this is where the idea for Ardeo really comes from, is Yale had just launched their LRAP. And the promise was awesome. Come here, and if you earn not much money when you graduate, we'll make your loan payments. And the idea coming from Yale, they weren't afraid of students not getting a good job. They really wanted to empower students to go choose nonprofit work, right? Go work for the government, work for a nonprofit, be altruistic, change the world. You can't do that with $100,000 of debt. So we're going to make it possible for you to go do something else. And Chicago wasn't doing that. So I looked at Chicago and I said, I would get a great education in Chicago, but it's not my first choice. And now I'll go take more debt at Yale, but I'll have the chance to go do anything I want to after graduation. And that's really where the idea for Ardeo comes from, is let's take these LRAPs that Yale provided and make them available to students.
Thank you so much for sharing. That's super interesting. And so the first question that comes up into my head is, I think of LRAP as sort of an enrollment tool. But of course, Yale is, I think, the number 2 law school in the world. So how did Yale use this tool of an LRAP besides enrollment? Because I'm sure they don't have problems recruiting students to come.
Absolutely, right? Yale has more students than they need, right? They get a huge number of applications and admit a lot of students. Well, they get a huge number of applications. They only admit a few every year. And they're really in competition with Stanford Law School. They're really in competition with Stanford Law School and Harvard Law School. And so for Yale, it's really a question about how do they compete more effectively. And at the time they came up with LRAP, Steve Yandel was the associate dean who put it together. And he was struggling to make sure that they would win those heads-up battles when a student was admitted to both Harvard and Yale or admitted to both Stanford and Yale. And once he rolled out the LRAP, they won those heads-up battles handily, whereas before they had struggled sometimes to win those. So even though they have plenty of students, every school always wants more better students, and every school wants to get those same students for less money. So Steve Yandel with the LRAP was able to package people like me for $20,000 less financial aid and still encouraged me to come to school, right? So the school saved, if you take that times 200 students, the school saved a huge amount of money compared to peers every year, and they could put those resources into other programs. So even the best schools have a real reason to see if they can't bring in students for a little bit less money, or if they can't win some of the more higher caliber students in their head-to-head competition with their competing colleges and universities.
I see. Thank you so much. That makes a lot of sense. And so, moving a little bit back to your story with an LRAP, I know that gives you a bit more job flexibility. You mentioned that Yale wanted a lot more people to take up nonprofit jobs and such. So, I'm wondering what you did with this flexibility. More basically, what did you do after going to law school?
I had a great time. I went to China and I went to Sudan, first to Sudan and then to
Oh,
China
wow.
to do human rights work. Spent almost a year and a half, well, almost 2 years, really traveling around the globe and doing human rights work in several different places. Got an article published at the Harvard Journal of International Law. So I had a great time, and that's exactly what Yandel wanted students to do when they came out of law school. And then I went to Wall Street and got a good job and paid off my loans myself, which was also the other piece of the reality, right? Yale couldn't afford to give a full ride to every student who said, I want to come to law school and then go do human rights work or nonprofit work, because a huge number of incoming students want to do that or say they want to do it. And a lot of graduates do it for a year, like I did. Very few do it for more than 3 or 4 years. And so the real cleverness here of the LRAP is Yandel promised students, if you spend your entire career in public interest, then after the fact, you got a free ride to Yale Law School. If you don't, if you go right to making money, you pay off your own loans, that's fine. If you spend a year or two doing human rights work or nonprofit work, government work, and then pay off your loans in a full paying job, that's fine too, right? So it's really an effective way to give people freedom to pursue what they want, to pursue their passions after graduation, and only spend the money on those graduates who most need it, instead of giving it to people up front who say they might go do nonprofit work and then end up going to Wall Street and making more money themselves.
Yeah, interesting. Wow. Sounds like you probably have a lot of adventures due to your experiences with LRAP and Yale Law School then. That sounds really interesting and exciting. So, jumping ahead of your personal story, when did you decide to start Ardeo? Was there a specific event that triggered this company idea?
So really two events triggered it. I joined the board of a small college where my mom taught, Central Christian College in McPherson, Kansas, just a few hundred students. And I was flying out to a board meeting, and I thought, we do a huge amount of work, or the college does, to get students interested in coming to apply. And then once they apply, we admit almost all of them, and only about 25% show up. And that number is probably less today, right? So I thought all that huge marketing effort to bring these students in the door, and then after they get admitted, most of them feel like they can't afford Central, and so they go to the local community college. And as I was thinking about that, I thought that's exactly the same situation Yale was in. Totally different student body. They're headed to different careers at a very different point in life, but they got interested in the school for whatever reason. And then when given the choice to attend, they said, no, I'm going to choose the cheaper option, right? Because I just can't afford it. And that really, went back to my experience at Wheaton and Greenville, not going to where I wanted to go. And then back to my experience at Yale and Chicago, getting to go that time to where I wanted to go. And I thought we at Central should offer the same promise that Yale is offering. But of course, a small little college has trouble doing it on their own. Yale has a big endowment. They've got a lot of people there. They've got access to real resources and expertise. They can hire actuaries. They can hire other people they need to design the program. And a small college like Central just can't do that. So that's where the idea came to me that I should set up an association where we could provide this program as a turnkey for colleges. And that's really where the idea came from of let's take this, commercialize it, and make it available to every college across the US so all of their students can benefit from it.
I love that. I love this full circle moment with your life, how you took this real life experience and sparked this idea of Ardeo Education Solutions to give out or work with client institutions to provide LRAP. So could you explain a little bit more about what is an LRAP? I know people might be wondering, how does this differ from IBRs or other types of loans?
Sure. So great question. So an LRAP is a loan repayment assistance program. And the promise to the students is very simple. Come here to this college who's giving it to you. When you graduate, if your income is below some number, often $45,000, $50,000, then we, the college, will help you repay your student loans until the loans are paid off or until your income goes above that upper income threshold. So that is an easy promise for students to wrap their minds around. It's an insurance-backed program, and like other insurance, there's several pages of terms and conditions. There's a lot of detail. The student has to graduate. They have to be working. There are some prorations if they're not working full-time or if their income is a little bit less than that $45,000. But the promise is very simple for a student to understand. We sell the program to colleges, and then the college gives it to students. So the college has a more complicated question of how do we choose who to give this to so that we, the college, can make money and give it to students where we can change enrollment and let's bring in more students so we, the college, can increase our revenue. You asked about comparing it to other things like income-based repayments. Some people compare us to ISAs, income share agreements. So the income-based repayment is a feature in federal government student loans that is also income-driven and is very similar to what we're doing with LRAPs. It's interesting to talk to families about the IBR feature in federal loans. Families don't trust the federal government. They're afraid the feds, the Congress will pull the rug out from under their students, or if they're the student, pull the rug out from under themselves before they graduate and before they need the help. Because everyone knows Congress, fiddles with programs, changes them to make them less expensive generally. Although in the recent years, there's been a lot of talk about how to make college more free and make it more accessible. But it's interesting how little families trust the federal government not to change that program. In any event, it's a great program in the federal student loans. We wrap around that. We're more generous than that program for the federal student loans. And we also cover private loans that students often have to take and Parent Plus loans that mom and dad often take to help support their students. We also get compared to income share agreements. And those really are very different for a college. Usually an income share agreement is used to help a student borrow a few more $1,000s when they can't get the loans for that. So if a student really, truly can't get enough loans to attend the college, the ISA can fill that last gap. We're used in a very different way. We're used for students who certainly can borrow the money they need to attend college, and they're just reluctant to, that are nervous to borrow it.
So getting us a bit on track with sort of the founding story of Ardeo Education Solutions. So you have this idea of LRAPs. You think this can be a pretty good program that helps students and client institutions around America. Did you start this venture alone? If not, who did you start this with? And how do these people continue to inspire the company?
So in some sense, yes, I started by myself. I was the only one in the company at the beginning, but started it with a number of advisors who have been great. And a lot of them are still involved every day as we work. The first one I've already mentioned, Steve Yandel. He was Associate Dean at Yale Law School. It's really his idea that we're taking out to colleges and universities across the country. And he's had a lot of really good advice about how to balance the program so it is really beneficial for students, but also affordable for colleges and gives colleges a good return on their investment. With Steve, I should mention Carol Stevens. He was Associate Dean for Advancement at Yale Law School, raised a lot of money to fund the program when they launched it. He's got a great network across higher education in the US, has introduced us to a lot of people, has been a really good source of inspiration. Someone else right away who started as an advisor was Matt Osborne, who was VP for enrollment at Spring Arbor University. I'd gotten to know him at Greenville College when I was a student there. And by the time I was ready to launch this, he had become VP for enrollment at Spring Arbor. So he signed up not only as our first client, but it talked to me every week and gave me ideas on how to make the program work better for him and for his students and for the college. So really great to have that kind of feedback right as we launched. He has joined us. He's now one of our top sales guys, which is fantastic. We're taking the program out to other colleges and universities. Should also mention Justin Mead. We needed an insurance partner as we launched the program, and the first company I found, Justin was there as their chief operating officer. He left them eventually and he joined us, and now he's our chief operating officer, and it's great to have him on the team. So those are 4 people who were involved very much at the beginning, giving us great advice and are still involved today.
Wow. Yeah, that's super lucky to have such a great group of people that I can attest are very intelligent, hardworking, amazing people. So, but of course, you're still a startup. And most startups, I just read actually before this interview, 90% of startups fail. So 14 years later, Ardeo Education Solutions is still standing here. When did you know Ardeo could be a great company? It could succeed after going from startup to now?
There have certainly been a lot of setbacks and challenges along the way, but it was great as soon as we launched. And it took a long time to launch. We had to get regulatory approval, and that just takes a long time, right? Bureaucracies move slow, but eventually we had all the paperwork together and eventually got the approval. And as soon as we got out into the field and started talking to students and families, their reactions were fantastic. Some of the students cried because it's made such a difference in their life. And it was really neat to confirm that my personal experience was not super unique, right? Instead, there were lots of students and families out there who say, wow, this really makes a difference in enabling me or enabling my son or daughter to go to the college they want to go to. So that was great to go out there and get that feedback. And with so many families giving us great feedback, with so many people asking, can I buy this for my son or daughter? It was just really neat to know that there was a demand for it and we could really help change people's lives. And then we just had to build the business around it to make sure the business would survive.
That's amazing. I'm sure many of the listeners, probably a majority of the listeners listening, are relating to your story, especially the fear of student loan debt when making college decisions. So, what would you say was the hardest part in the early stages of the company's growth, or generally any adversities you had to overcome?
Well, we had two that were really hard. Right out of the gates, I launched in 2008 and ran right into the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. Made it just impossible to raise any capital from venture capital companies. So we had to bootstrap and just go along with whatever little bits of money we could raise from angel investors. And eventually we raised a fair bit from angel investors all told, but made the start much more difficult than I thought it was going to be. The other early hardship we had to overcome was we hired a woman, Ruthie Wellhausen. She was great, became a good friend, was a great saleswoman, was taking this out to lots of colleges. And then she got cancer and passed away, which of course was a horrible thing for her family, but also from our business perspective was a real setback and slowed us down. So one of our conference rooms is named after her, and the name we use, Ardeo, really comes in memory of her. She had on a signature for her email the quote that it's attributed to lots of different people, but the quote that says, education is not the filling of a bucket, but is the lighting of a fire. And she really loved that quote, and we would talk about that. And so when we went to choose a name later, we started as LRAP Association and then changed our name to Ardeo Education Solutions. And we chose Ardeo because it's the Latin word for to burn with passion, and links right into that quote from Ruthie about, really we are passionate about the life-changing impact of higher education. And we really do want to light a fire to make it possible for people to follow their dreams. And so, we was neat to have her influence on the company, was neat to have known her. Really wish that she was still with us, obviously, but was great to have her as part of the team. And then we just had to overcome that loss and move on a little bit more slowly.
Yeah, of course. It's great to hear that, of course, that is an unfortunate tragedy, but it did help Ardeo become the company it is. And Ruthie was able to influence Ardeo, become Ardeo, literally. And so do you have any advice for other startups that may face similar adversities or just generally have the issues that come with being a startup company?
Well, two thoughts there. One is that building the culture is every bit as important as building the business. Ruthie had a huge impact on the culture that we developed as a team. And it really, when I was by myself, the culture was myself. But every time we added people after that, and she was the third hire and was with us for several years, every time we added people, the new hires always, of course, impacted what that culture was because they brought ideas themselves and they contributed to how we built the culture. So certainly some advice to founders as they start companies is pay a lot of attention to the culture, invest in it, and it really matters. It really helps attract employees and make the place a place worth living and worth working. Other advice I have is that most startups are bootstrapped. Most do not get venture capital funding, and bootstrapping is totally different than when you get venture funding. The decisions you have to make are different. The pathway you take is different. Almost all the publications about startups are written from a venture capital funded point of view. So I really encourage founders when I talk to them to think about, are they very soon going to be venture funded, or are they on the bootstrapping pathway? And then when they look for advice, when they read advice, find the advice that is applicable to them. And don't be misled by some advice that just is a different situation if you have venture money than if you don't. And there's so much advice on Google. I spend time every week reading about other startups, reading advice from founders. There's just really great advice out there that you really need to invest in order to understand the decisions you're facing as a founder as it grows.
So as you mentioned, Ardeo was a bootstrap startup. So what were those differences you found or hardships that you faced because of that?
So one of the big differences is hiring people. So we were bootstrapped and there was never enough money to do all the things we needed to do. So for years, when we went to hire someone else, we would look around and see where do we have the greatest pain points and who's the cheapest person we can hire to do the work that needs to be done. And that's such a contrast to a company that starts with a bunch of venture capital money. And they start by saying, who are the 3 or 4 people that we need who are the best in the world at doing this, whether it's marketing or building, software engineering. Let's go hire really great people, and then we'll put a team underneath them to support them. And that lead gives you a very different organizational structure, a very different set of internal capabilities. Eventually, as we grew, we got to the point where we could start asking the question, who's the best candidate we can find? Let's go hire them. But for years, we would just hire people at minimum wage and hope they could do a good enough job to move us forward. And they did, and we built a great team.
Yeah, thank you so much. And so, like you said, Ardeo was founded during the Great Recession and almost 14 years ago, I think. And so I'm sure the market has changed quite a bit since then. And so I was wondering, how has it changed and how has it affected the way Ardeo operates?
So in some ways, it hasn't changed very much at all. Colleges and universities really don't change rapidly, but the entire world is changing, right? The entire world is embracing the internet and technology, and that is sorting through every organization out there in every industry. What is really different today than 14 years ago is how much people are talking about the problem of student loans and how do we solve this problem of student loans and what can we do to give relief to students from the burden of having to repay it so it doesn't change their whole life after graduation. So it's neat to have so many more people talking about this issue that we're working on every day, and we have a great solution for it.
That's interesting. I wonder, during the Great Recession, was there not a lot of conversation about student loans, or do you think people were going to college less, or what was the difference in that general narrative? Were people just not talking about student loans as an issue?
It wasn't that they weren't talking about student loans, but I think every decade since student loans originated, students have borrowed more. Colleges have raised tuition. So 30, 40 years ago, people borrowed student loans, but it was a relatively small amount and people didn't worry about it too much. And then starting maybe 20 years ago, you had people who were borrowing 50,000 and more. And while those are rare cases, they start generating a lot more conversation. And the average student today still only borrows $28,000, but media stories make it sound like they borrow 100,000. And a lot of people know someone who borrowed 50 or 100,000, or they've heard that story, right? And it's those can be really horrible stories where people get out with so much debt that it really does hurt the rest of their life for years. And while those are rare stories, and most students do have only a smaller amount, and most students get a job that pays well enough that they can pay back their loans, there's a lot of students who come out and they struggle for several years until their income rises. And that's really the group we try to help. We try to help that when their income is low, we make their loan payments. And as the income rises, then they can pick up the loan payments on their own and take that pain point away. But I think it's really common for people to know a nephew, a niece, or the son or daughter of someone at work who has struggled to repay their loans. And I think that's those stories have become so much more common, which I think is why people pay much more attention to it today.
That makes sense. And so next, I kind of have the biggest question of all for you. What is your ultimate goal for Ardeo Education Solutions as the founder?
Well, I think every student should have a safety net that LRAP provides so they don't have to worry about where they go to college. The fear of student loans should not change where a student goes to college. It shouldn't change what they study. It shouldn't change the job they choose after graduation. So I personally, and I think, everyone who works at Ardeo, we really want to get these LRAPs in the hands of every student so they can go to the college they want to go to. They can study whatever they want to study, follow their dreams, pursue their passions, and not worry about repaying their student loans, not let them be a burden on their future.
Thank you. Yes, that is a very admirable goal. And following up with that question, I have to ask, what is next for Ardeo?
We are growing every year. We're adding people to the team. We're working with more colleges. We're working with more students. I just think that's going to continue for a long time into the future. We love working with more students. And every time that we get the chance to work with a new college, it's just a lot of fun.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for being such a wonderful guest today. That's all the questions I have for you. And you've brought so much wonderful information about your personal story and how Ardeo Education came to be. So is there anything else you'd like to add?
If any listeners want to reach out to me with any questions, happy to take questions. I'm at peter@ardeo.org. Ardeo is ARDEO. So feel free to reach out to me, peter@ardeo.org. And thank you, V, for having me.
Yeah, of course. Sounds great. Thank you so much again, Peter.
Thanks.
This podcast is brought to you by Ardeo Education Solutions. Ardeo Education Solutions provides loan repayment assistance programs, known as LRAPs, to increase access and enrollment at higher ed institutions. Ardeo's LRAPs help graduates with modest incomes repay their federal student, Parent Plus, and private alternative loans. The powerful promise they provide gives students the confidence they need to enroll. To learn more about Ardeo, visit us on the web at ardeo.org.